We're grateful to have you joining us for today's Fighting Hate from Home, Extremism and Political Violence in America, the current landscape and the future outlook. Today, we're pleased to be joined by ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt, Vice President of ADL's Center on Extremism, Oren Segal, and in the second half hour, Representative Mikie Sherrill for today's discussion. And with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Jonathan to get us started. Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Deb. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I'm so grateful for everyone joining us. You're really in for a treat today. Congresswoman Cheryl has a pretty remarkable story to tell. But before I get to that, it's really a pleasure for me to share some initial thoughts and then to pass the baton to my colleague, Oren Segal, the Vice President of our Center on Extremism at ADL, and one of the leading experts in the United States on these issues of extremism and hate. So quickly, I think we are 24 hours plus since the inauguration of Joe Biden, and I think the 46th President of the United States is already auguring in both substance and style a very different type of presidency than what we saw over the past 4 years. I think that will be a good thing, as it were, on the issues that we care about at ADL, which is the anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of hate, and how we depress those phenomena and push them from the mainstream back out into the margins where they belong. But the reality is we will also be dealing for some time with the consequences of the attack on Capitol Hill. And let's be clear, what happened on January the 6th, it wasn't a riot, it was attack. Those weren't protesters leading the charge up the stairs to Congress, they were militants. There was nothing sort of spontaneous about it. It was a highly planned and, dare I say, professional assault on the seat of our government. Indeed, I think one could describe it as the most predictable terror attack in American history. And anyone who's been paying attention to extremist activity across the country or to the course of disinformation on social media over the past 6 months, really pioneered by the president with the claims of a delegitimate or an illegitimate election, knew that the seeds were being sown for what flourished on January the 6th. ADL has and will continue to beat the drum, excuse me, about this growing far-right insurgency. And I do think insurgency is the right way to describe it. The individuals behind this attack, while we have in the law enforcement's arrested several hundred people who are involved, we know that those are sort of the shock troops. There are more people behind this movement, a movement that is conspiratorial in nature, that's fed by forces like QAnon, and that predicates upon a sense of grievance. And that grievance feeds the kind of animosity that we've seen through the annals of history that is intolerant of minority communities, that holds a particular hatred toward the Jewish people, and that would seek to use violence to perpetrate their aims. I think we're going to need to just come to grips with the fact that there is a potential longevity for this insurgency in our country. President Trump gave them the gift of a narrative that will carry them through the next 4 years, a story about a stolen election, all thanks to the left, the mainstream media, who, as the narrative goes, are trying to suppress the rights and the voices of, quote, real Americans. Extremists who are often animated by paranoid notions that something sacred has been stolen from them. So I think as we think about what do they look like in a post-Trump world, they are a new breed of extremists, that live in their own echo chamber, their own kind of ecosystem of disinformation and lies. And it's fertilized by folks like Alex Jones or QAnon. And again, it is, if you will, laundered by mainstream personalities like a Tucker Carlson and others. And it's deeply, deeply troubling. I think over the coming months and years, as they mingle with established extremists, whether they're white supremacists or anti-government types or hardcore conspiracy theorists, these individuals who now feel, again, aggrieved and alienated, they're susceptible to radicalization. And they could indeed coalesce into a distinct and potent extremist movement of their own right. And that is very troublesome. And I think one of the main factors that could facilitate that coalescence will be the role that social media plays. And we've seen some of the mainstream services like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and others take some important steps, but we generally don't think they've gone far enough and the emergence of alternative platforms that replace the mainstream ones, from YouTube to DLive, from Twitter to Parler, from Facebook to new kind of social media sites, that could mean that this problem is prolonged and becomes even more persistent. So I've got some additional thoughts, but in the interest of time, I'd like to turn it over to Oren to share his perspective on these issues. Oren?
Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks for all of you for making the time. It's been 2 weeks, 2 very, very long weeks since the deadly siege of the Capitol in DC. And since then, it seems like a lot has changed. We have a new president. The Capitol has been cleaned. Despite the raging pandemic, economic concerns, and other stresses, despite all that, there does seem to be almost an unfamiliar calm. Maybe that's just me, but I also know that this is just going to be for a moment. The landscape of extremism has changed quite a bit as well, even over in 2 weeks. And we're going to be trying to make sense out of all that we've seen for some time. I think the country is still asking itself what happened. What's in store for us now? And I think perhaps the most important question of all is, how do we adapt to these changes and to the uncertainty in the extremist landscape? Initially after the events of January 6th, there was a lot of concern about activity on the 17th or on Inauguration Day. And luckily, we've gotten past that. It's true that we documented 9 different cities around the country on the 17th in which members of the Boogaloo, these sort of anti-authoritarian, anti-government, sometimes anti-police individuals, showed up in relatively small force, very peaceful on that day. Inauguration came and went without the violence that folks were concerned about. 25,000 troops may have had something to do with that as well. We've also seen over 135 people arrested who were involved in storming the Capitol on January 6th. Among those are QAnon adherents, white supremacists, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, but also former military, active duty military, a few, some police officers, elected officials, people in positions of trust and responsibility. By their actions, they violated the public's trust and put them and threatened society that they were supposed to serve. But also arrested, as we're tracking this, were attorneys, a nurse, a teacher, CEO, bartender, beautician, apparently an Olympic swimmer, a stay-at-home dad, a loan officer. Truth is, my mind keeps going back to that list of people. Those are the folks who are not part of any established extremist group or movement, yet they represent the anger that many still have, and a possible emerging extremist movement that is not ready to forget the conspiracies and the disinformation and the grievances that led them to DC on January 6th. Are they lost? How do we address that element of the extremist landscape? These are the serious questions and challenges that we have to think about moving forward, because they are going to animate the extremist movement moving forward. And of course, the tech industry responded. Although, as is often the case, they tend to respond after a tragedy. So for example, Twitter announced the suspension of over 70,000 accounts dedicated to sharing QAnon content. That response was in reaction to mounting public pressure, campaigns, much of that which was led by ADL itself. According to a study by my colleagues in the Center on Technology and Society, immediately following the suspension of those QAnon accounts on January 8th, the use of QAnon-related hashtags plunged by 73%. You can find that report on our website. And currently, it's 97% lower than it was at the height of the spike that followed the Capitol insurrection. That's an improvement. Other platforms have struggled to stay afloat. Many of you have heard of Parler, which was the virtual manifestation of what we saw on January 6th, a place where extremists and conspiracists would mix and mingle with regular people, growing their reach and their narratives, and fundamentally trying to undermine and threaten our democratic institutions. We often talk about through lines between extremist events in this country: Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso. We talk about through lines between these attacks and what our leaders say or what they don't say. But perhaps one of the most blatant through lines is between our communication technology and what we're seeing on the ground. These online spaces are incubators of hate and lies. I know my team has spent way too much time on these platforms. I suspect probably some of you have as well. The most undisciplined of these online spaces normalize the narratives that fuel anger and incite people to action. So to understand the threats of the future, we need to understand how this deplatforming, in part, is currently being viewed by the extremists themselves. To them, in some ways, this is an extension of their grievances. First, their freedom is taken away by our laws and our norms, then their election, and now they feel like their voice is being taken away. That sense of something being stripped away is a powerful animating factor. But a result of the deplatforming has also meant that these animated narratives are struggling to some degree to reach a wider audience. But let's not kid ourselves. Extremists, as they always do, will find alternatives. And the current discussion on these alternative platforms that we are tracking, to quote one of my most respected colleagues, is an absolute hot mess. So for example, QAnon adherents have struggled to find any one single narrative now that their leader has left the Oval Office. Some are looking at scapegoats, others are calling it quits, some are convinced that the plan is still going to reveal itself. Some of the commentaries suggest that the beliefs did not end up coming true and that people need to step away. Okay. For others, Biden is somehow a vehicle for Trump, that Trump made a deal with Biden and he's secretly running the show, that somehow they swapped brains. One theory is that they actually swapped faces, surgically swapped faces. This is QAnon after all. Others are asserting that Q is in control and that Trump actually gave up power so as not to be viewed as a dictator and that he will reemerge in the future when the time is right. There are so many of these conspiracies out there, it's probably not the best idea to give most of them oxygen. But they seem absurd, yet we know that no claim is too absurd to not be believed by somebody, especially those who are angry and looking for some answers. And as conspiracies always do, they will find a hook, they will find a narrative, they'll find meaning, and they will regroup in some form or fashion. Indeed, much of the chatter that we are monitoring in these extremist spaces, even as diffuse as they have become, are concerning. For example, Ashley Babbitt, the Trump supporter and QAnon follower who was killed during the Capitol siege, has quickly become a celebrated martyr. The symbolic weight of her death is meaningful to extremists who are calling for justice and demonizing both government and law enforcement. Some extremists have embraced her as an innocent victim of law enforcement, comparing her death to those of right-wing extremists and even some Black people who have been killed by police over the last few years. Anti-law enforcement sentiments are increasing, with online users denouncing pigs who murdered the unarmed patriot. The talk about law enforcement providing cover and protection also, as if they're doing that for the left wing, for the elites, that they are protecting lockdown restrictions that are a sign of tyranny. Even white supremacists see Babbitt not just as a symbol standing against tyranny, but also a symbol of white resistance. Posts that we have seen across various different platforms specifically note her race. One such post referring to her as a brave white woman who should rest in white power. The tech industry's response has been important, but we know that there's also responses to that response. And many extremists seem to want to put the tech industry itself in the crosshairs for the deplatforming efforts that I mentioned before. Also, politicians on both sides of the aisle are not necessarily viewed as representatives of their communities, but rather as traitors. Some have received death threats, as well as visits to their private residences, online harassment. There's a narrative of anger, of a liberal agenda that is going to force social values onto this country. You know, one of my colleagues found a discussion between conspiracy theorist Alex Jones and Oath Keeper leader Stuart Rhodes yesterday. And that conversation included this exchange, with Rhodes saying, "We no longer have a legitimate president." And Jones responding, "Clearly they are trying to trigger events to go after the American people. Clearly they are preparing to start a civil war." These narratives are dangerous. For every Q adherent that is feeling defeated, there are others who will regroup, that they're going to retool, and frankly, the fight has just begun for them. We know that white supremacists and some other extremists are driven by these manufactured fears of demographic changes, which they believe will accelerate during the Biden administration, which will likely enact more humane policies toward non-white immigrants and refugees. The extremists will view that as white genocide. The militia movement has historically derived much of its energy from its rage toward the federal government. However, the movement's support for Trump over the past few years has dulled that anger. The Biden administration will allow militias to return to their foundational grievances, that a tyrannical government in league with a globalist conspiracy is coming to enslave them by first taking their gun and then the rest of their rights. Finally, anti-Semitism will often be a central part of the conspiratorial view that fuels some of the violence that we're talking about. Many of the key narratives, especially the conspiracy theories that animated the DC attackers, are also drivers of anti-Semitism. Ongoing high-level efforts to undermine American democracy through voter suppression constitute a threat that puts all minorities at increased risk. One of the elements of January 6th that may be forgotten is that there were pipe bombs with wires placed at both Republican and Democratic National Committee headquarters. The U.S. Capitol Police confirmed that the devices could have caused great harm. My understanding is that a woman passed by on her morning walk and saw that and flagged that to law enforcement. The gravity of what occurred is still being figured out, even 2 weeks later. It's impossible for anybody to predict with any certainty how things are going to unfold from here with any specificity. But recent history has shown that we cannot ignore potential threats and that we are at the start, not the end of this story. The extremists are retooling, but so are we. The ADL will be there just as we have been throughout. And that young woman who was passing by the Democratic and Republican National Convention and saw those bombs, that's all of us now. We need to keep our eyes open. Thank you.
Thank you, Oren. Informative and frightening as always, so thank you. We've gotten a bunch of questions and we do have a little bit of time before the Congresswoman joins us. So let me ask you, we've seen a few different permutations of this question, lots of questions about quantifying how many people there really are who are falling into this QAnon camp or this extremist camp. It seems, the way it's been reported to be such a large percentage. Do you have any sense of what that real number would be?
I'll pass, Oren, you should answer that.
Yeah, so, it's hard to know exactly how many. I know that there have been some studies that suggested between 15 and 30 million people in the US alone. My sense is from that study is that includes people who have engaged with QAnon who may not necessarily know that they were engaging. So some people may recall, as an example, a hashtag about Save the Children, and who on this call wouldn't want to be part of something that's actually saving children? But that was a tactic in which once somebody scratches the surface a little bit about who's behind that, what they meant is save the children from the deep state and the Democrats and Hollywood pedophiles who are trying to take advantage of them. That's the twist that extremists put. So it's hard to give exact numbers, but based on the volume of online discussion, based on who we saw in DC, the numbers are pretty massive.
Yeah, it certainly does seem this way. We've also had a couple of questions, and I think the same theme came up on our last call, asking about the validity of rumors that Black Lives Matter protesters or Antifa folks were really the ones who were responsible for what happened on January 6th. Can we talk about that for a moment?
Look,
Jonathan, go ahead.
look, it's factually incorrect, period. End of story. Is it possible that there was one person amongst the thousands? I don't know. I suppose that's certainly possible. But I would say that while Antifa does exist, the rumors of it as some highly organized, disciplined force are just wrong. And it bears no comparison to the far-right extremist kind of movements that are much better organized, much better coordinated. And, Oren's mentioned several strands of them on this call, from the Oath Keepers and the other armed militia groups like the Three Percenters who were there, to the different white supremacist groups who were there. Make no mistake, those people who have been arrested, those people who rampaged through the halls of the building, those people who were intentionally selecting the offices of Democratic members and Democratic staffers, they were inspired by and took their guidance from President Trump. And we know that because that's what they said they were doing. So I think we should believe people we should believe people and take them at their words. And that was the case here. There is no Antifa conspiracy or anything remotely close to that.
So I thought this was an interesting question. Given the state of the world, the pandemic, and all of the restrictions that have been in place since early last year, do you think there's any connection to the growth of this extremist movement and the following of QAnon that correlates with that?
So I'm happy to take that. I think, when you look at how did we end up with what we saw on January 6th, I think we can look back not too far into the distant past to see clues, right? This is why we were shocked but not completely surprised. And so one of the responses to the pandemic, when people had to stay home, when businesses were impacted, were a range of protests at state capitals around the country that were reopened protests. Now, I want to be clear, many of the people who showed up at those protests were legitimately concerned about their livelihood. They didn't know how they were going to make money if their business was closed. Some of them were anti-vaxxers. Some of them just didn't believe that the government should tell us when to close our stores or to wear masks. But there were also extremists that came, because extremists never miss an opportunity to get attention, to put in their narrative, to try to leverage the situation. And so one of the results of the pandemic was extremists coming out to state capitals, arming themselves in opposition to state governments, referring to them as tyrannical, referring to them as taking something away from them. That sounds very familiar to what we saw on December 6th. In fact, I believe it was practice, because those same people who showed up talked about, instead of state governments taking away their freedoms, it was people stealing their election. And their response, again, was to storm a Capitol in a way, though, that we had not seen before.
Right. So Jonathan, maybe over to you. Can you speak a little bit about how ADL is planning to address this in the coming year and what some of our strategies are going to be to combat this kind of hate?
I think there are a few things. I think the real question is, how is society going to deal with this issue? And I think we're indeed going to need a whole of society approach. Government has a role. We were engaged with the Biden transition team. We're engaging now with the folks at the White House and other bureaus like FBI, DHS, Justice. You're going to need to identify and arrest and prosecute and punish to the fullest extent of the law all the people who participated in the attack, and demonstrate that there is no place that kind of activity can never be legitimized. So I think you're going to need, and then beyond that, a robust effort to root out this form of domestic terror, because that's what it is. This is domestic terror, and it should be treated as such, with the kind and resourced as such. So you're going to need law enforcement and the policy apparatus, the executive branch, to go after this source of domestic terror. And you're going to need to also focus on the healing side too. So how we can use, the capabilities of agencies like HHS and education, and maybe the Corporation for National Service, to think about how do we bring communities together and prevent people from being radicalized any further. Because again, you shouldn't hate someone based on how they pray or where they're from or how they vote. right? So we need to ask more of people to bring the country together. So I think the executive branch has a role to play. Congress has a role to play. I think it's critical to demonstrate that there'll be no tolerance for elected officials who promote insurrection against our own government. No matter what office you might have occupied, there is nothing permissible about undermining democracy. So I think Congress has a role to play as well to make sure that the legislative tools are there. And I think state and locals have a role to play too, so that law enforcement's engaged, but also that education departments are engaged in these issues. I think business has a role to play, not just that businesses continue to hold up things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which matter, but also that they make sure that there are values across their value chain. So you think about fair trade, right, or non-slave labor for apparel, for foodstuffs or apparel. I think we need to make sure that there's an anti-hate agenda inside the boardroom, so that they are not intentionally or unintentionally ignoring the needs to address this kind of extremism, and that there's values across a corporate value chain, right? So how they manufacture and produce and distribute their products, to where they spend their ad dollars. Are they spending it on platforms, social media or traditional media, that promote disinformation and hate? And what they do with their political donations and their profits. I think companies need to recognize the role that they play. And then finally, nonprofits. So some groups like ADL will be involved in fighting hate, and you can better believe we're going to use all of our powers to try to assist law enforcement in their work and to push things like anti-bias education in schools and maybe civics education in schools. But I also think there are other nonprofits that have a role to play too, not just ADL. So groups that, that promote volunteerism and service, like Points of Light or City Year or Teach for America. Again, I think national service can be a strategy to bring people together across divides and promote better understanding. So how do we fight this? It requires a whole of society approach. Government has a role to play, business has a role to play, and nonprofits, particularly ADL, have a crucial role to play as well.
So building on that question a little bit, can you speak at all to policy work? There's obviously a lot of issues coming up around domestic terrorism. What do you see in the future there? I mean, this also bleeds into 230 and social media. There's so many questions now that I think will be deeply affected by policy in the coming years.
So I think we've got to prioritize the fight against domestic terrorism. So I think we've got to prioritize, preventing and countering domestic terrorism. And so making sure that our intelligence and law enforcement apparatus is focused on it, which is critical, right? So secondly, we've got to resource to the threat. There's a piece of legislation circulating called Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would enhance the government's ability to address this issue by formally authorizing offices that address domestic terror and forcing local law enforcement to report on the issue. That should happen. We need to oppose extremists gaining positions of power in government. Oren was speaking a few minutes ago about QAnon. We've got to take steps to ensure that individuals associated with violent extremist movements are not employed in government, are not in policy-making positions, and those that are should be prevented from gaining access to committees or access to resources. We've got to take the weapons away from the perpetrators of hate crimes. There's a piece of legislation out there called the Disarm Hate Act that would effectively close the loophole that permits sales of firearms to people convicted of hate crimes, which I think makes a lot of sense. And we certainly need to end the complicity of social media in facilitating extremism. So whether it's Section 230 reform, or whether it's just getting the social media companies to enforce their own terms of service, we've really got to end the complicity of media in facilitating extremism. And then I'll just say two more things. We need to call out hate-based violence as domestic terror. As I said at the beginning of this, the attack on January the 6th, and so much of the terrible, mass shootings that we've seen in places like El Paso or Pittsburgh or Charleston, they need to be considered and classified as domestic terror, which would allow the federal government and local government to deal with them more effectively. And then finally, we believe at ADL that white supremacy is a global terror threat. We see links between white supremacists in the U.S. and in different parts of the world. We see increasing links between far-right extremists in the U.S. and places like Europe or Australia and New Zealand. We've got to target overseas white identity extremist groups and designate them as foreign terror organizations. This was an initiative that Congressman Max Rose was pushing when he was chair of the Terrorism Subcommittee on House Intelligence in the last session, and I'm optimistic that the new chair, Congresswoman Cheryl, can be looking at this as well. So those are some quick thoughts.
Thank you for that. This question is a little bit more basic, but I have to tell you, it's one that I get a lot as well. Oren, can you speak a little bit to exactly what QAnon is? There are always questions about if this is its own designated group, if it's a movement. And I think there's still a lot of confusion that exists over exactly what it is and how it got such a foothold.
Sure, and for those people who are confused a bit about QAnon is, that's a good thing, right? Anybody who's too familiar with what QAnon is maybe got down that rabbit hole a little too deep. But essentially, it's not so much a group, but it is a wide reaching conspiracy theory that's popular amongst a range of extremists and even people who are not 100% extreme, just primarily Trump supporters. Not all Trump supporters are QAnon supporters. I want to be clear. But fundamentally, it's something that views Donald Trump as sort of a savior battling against various evil in the world. It surfaced in 2017 on a fringe platform called 4chan, and it was essentially a trolling effort. And it is difficult to sort of gauge the size of it, as we talked before, but its membership has become much more sort of broad-based. They believe in very, very absurdist sort of claims, yet that have somehow been able to be believed by some of them. So for example, Donald Trump was fighting a large cabal of both Democrats, people in Hollywood that essentially were the sort of the deep state. And then what they were in addition to that were pedophiles, and they were engaging in sex trafficking. And that's why they were so evil. And Donald Trump was viewed as the person who was fighting against that. Furthermore, the sort of control the concepts that QAnon had made it feel that their personal freedoms were being taken away. And so I would only add that when you talk about conspiracy theories of government control, media manipulation, for some, the strains of anti-Semitism were there, right? Because what did those things harken back to? Again, there are many different ways that conspiracy theories evolve over time, and they take different strains, and a whole bunch of sort of different belief systems get thrown in there. But the point that is most important is that people believed in this cabal, in this shadowy deep state, to the point that they needed to undermine our democratic institutions. And we had seen violence prior to January 6th associated with those movements. Because again, when people feel like something's being taken away from them by evil people, what are they going to do? And that's the fundamental part of that conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Oren said, it's so dangerous because indeed, if you think the government is illegitimate, if you think there are pedophiles in Capitol Hill, if you think that the election was stolen from you, okay, then you have to do something about it. So it's deranged. And what we need to do is make sure that our media, traditional media and certain cable news stations and social media don't facilitate the flow of this kind of poison, because that's what it is. It's poison. And in the old world, where facts mattered, this would never see the light of day. But, as Yale professor Timothy Snyder has said, post-truth is pre-fascist. And we can't afford to live in a post-truth society. And we shouldn't tolerate elected officials who would encourage and inflame that phenomenon. It's deeply dangerous.
This is obviously an extraordinary amount of work and a huge problem to be tackling. Is ADL working with any partner organizations in trying to address all of this?
We work with different kinds of partners. I'll take that. I'll start this question and then hand it over to Oren if he wants to add to it. So again, the issues we're talking about are kind of multi-dimensional. So number one, I just talked about the role of media. And the ADL helped to organize something called the Stop Hate for Profit Coalition last summer that brought in the NAACP, Color of Change, LULAC, which is the League of United Latin American Citizens. So some longstanding civil rights groups, along with child advocacy groups like Common Sense Media, along with First Amendment organizations like Free Press, and as well a great organization that works on internet freedom called the Mozilla Foundation. And through this coalition, we applied pressure to Facebook when they were failing to deal with the hate that was rampant on their platform. And our coalition organized advertisers to take a pause on their spending on Facebook for the month of July until the company did something about hate speech. We ended up pulling in over 1,000 of the biggest brands in the world: Coca-Cola, Disney, McDonald's, Pepsi, Starbucks, Levi's, Hershey's, Ford, VW, Honda, Diageo, Unilever. And ultimately that resulted in Facebook making material changes, again, concessions based on the demands that we put out, hiring a civil rights VP, submitting to an audit of their hate content, taking down white supremacist content, classifying Holocaust denialism as hate speech and removing it from the platform, kicking off armed militias, and so on and so forth. So that was somewhat successful. We did that in coalition with others. We also work in coalition with other organizations to deal with, as we're trying to identify extremists, whether it's the FBI and law enforcement authorities or other nonprofits that work in this space. So, and then finally, we share our intelligence actively with other organizations. So some of those other organizations in the Jewish community, like Jewish federations or JCRCs, Jewish Community Relations Councils. Sometimes we do that with, or partners like SCAN, Secure Communities Network. Sometimes we do it with organizations outside the Jewish community. Again, that might be Black-led organizations supporting African Americans, or Latinx organizations supporting that community, or LGBTQ or Muslim organizations. So it just depends.
Thank you for that. Oren, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think that was a comprehensive list. And then obviously, I think for the Center on Extremism in particular, there's other academics and scholars that help us sort of understand the threat of extremism and how to sort of best mitigate that.
I think it's a comprehensive list indeed. Jonathan, maybe you can speak quickly about, before the Congresswoman joins us, who is running a bit late, but she will be here in a couple of moments. But before we do that, we're getting a lot of questions about how this can be addressed in schools and asking about what kind of programming ADL education offers. Can you speak to that a bit?
Well, ADL is quite focused. I mean, we believe that to stop hate, you can't just sort of, prosecute your way out of it or, policy way out of it. You got to change hearts and minds. So ADL is one of the largest providers in the United States of anti-bias, anti-hate education in schools, reach more than 1.5 million kids a year. So the goal is to intercept intolerance before it happens, to educate the next generation on the fact that diversity is a strength, that the richness of our country in terms of the, the variability of our people is actually one of the great assets of America. So we are, making that case every day, and school by classroom, class by class, school by school, district by district, state by state across the country. And, I think ultimately a 21st century education is pivotal, that it includes not just things like STEM, but it includes other things like civics and, again, anti-bias.
Thank you for that. And I'm pleased to see that the Congresswoman has joined us. So if you'll allow me briefly to give a quick introduction, and then we will get right to it. So Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill has proudly represented New Jersey's 11th Congressional District since 2019. Prior to her time in Congress, she spent almost 10 years on active duty in the United States Navy and served in both the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey and as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. Congresswoman Cheryl sits on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Education and Labor Committee, as well as serves as chairwoman of the Environment Subcommittee for the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. It's amazing she has a moment in the day. Thank you, Congresswoman, for making that time and being with us today.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with a group that has really stood up over the years against discrimination and against the kind of division the country's really dealing with now. And I think a group that has such a long history also understands the root causes better than so many of us. And so I'm excited to be here today. I just want to thank again to Jonathan Greenblatt and Oren Segal, who's in my own neighborhood, for having me today. I'll tell you, I was on the floor of the House of Representatives, I was up in the gallery section when the attack came. We were trying to perform our constitutional duty of certifying the election. And because of the rhetoric from the president, because of misinformation, because of his activation of so many violent extremists and enticement to come to the Capitol, we were attacked as we were trying to do that. And the saddest part about it is there are people across this country that think, because of the president's words and other people who were really complicit with the president, that the election was unfairly decided. So I guess the question I keep having and have had for several years now is, how did we get here? How did we come to this moment where things that I thought were bedrocks of our American democracy, and things I took for granted, like the peaceful transition of power, how have they been so eroded, and what are the root causes of that erosion? How do we have a president, now as I have been enjoying saying for 24 hours, a former president who sowed so much division? And as I think about that, I know that many times part of the difficulty was really believing what he was doing. You know, believing that he really wasn't going to concede the election, believing that he really was supporting these extremist groups, to the point where he didn't even speak out when they tried to kidnap the Michigan governor. It's just so difficult to wrap your mind around and to believe how much support he had in such a short period of time. And so I think we need to understand a couple things, that too many people let him get away with kind of the little things until it just became the nature of too many people in elected office to not stand up as things got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so when we look at the fact that that so many people were willing to turn a blind eye to his racism, to his anti-Semitism, to his hatred, if their taxes were lowered, or if he had a policy with respect to foreign affairs that they agreed with, or if they just felt compelled by that hatred. And I've been thinking in my mind, which is worse, that there are so many people that really bought into it and are true believers of this hatred and this ideology, or is it worse that we have people that I think aren't believers in it, and yet we're willing to tolerate it, we're willing to not speak out against it because they felt as if he was supporting other goals. And as we move forward, we have to get to the bottom of these questions. Just what happened? Why did it happen? Where were the moments that intervention could have made a difference? What are we going to do about social media and that drive of people as you start to get more and more extreme views? What are we going to do about the 24-hour news cycle? What are we going to do about misstatements from people in power? And so, along with Jackie Spear, another Congresswoman, I've put forth a request to start a commission to look at how did we get to January 6th? Who is in that? And I think that hopefully we can get some of the answers. And again, I'm hoping we can work with ADL, just because I know this is something you've studied even before we saw this divisive administration. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. I think, I have to say, first and foremost, you sort of, as they say, you had us at hello. So, I mean, you've got us as your partners and thought partners and implementers to kind of proceed in however we can be of service to Congress as this issue is investigated and we try to understand the roots of the problem. But I just do have to ask, like, you were on the record before most in talking about the fact that it appeared that the perpetrators of the attack, the militants who led this, had help on the inside. You were out in front of that for anybody else in Congress. Can you talk to us a little bit about, where that sentiment came from on your end, and, tell us a little bit more about what led you to make that assertion?
Sure. So I think the hardest thing that I've had to do and many of us have had to do, is to believe that what we saw happening with our own eyes was actually happening. And I know that sounds funny, but I'll tell you, I began to grow concerned in the spring, for example, that this president was not going to concede the election. After putting troops on the streets for the Black Lives Matter movement, hearing that he might want to put troops at polling places or utilize our active duty military, some of the pressure that was being put on the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I knew that there was work to be done there. And yet it was, I remember questioning the Secretary of Defense back in the spring about his constitutional duties and his duties to statutes and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And as he was answering these kind of foundational questions, do you understand there can be only one president and that's decided by the voters and the military has no place in a partisan election? He had this bemused look on his face, like, yeah. His questions were basically like, yes, and just kind of looking at me like, what are you doing? And I think there were others probably that felt the same way, because it's so hard to believe that a commander in chief would really be considering what we might call in another country a military coup, really utilizing military forces. And once we asked those questions, and I think especially Chairman Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, really understood that and came out with very strong statements about the military's role. We saw the president looking to DHS. We saw him looking to other law enforcement agencies, to the National Guard, and looking at how he could do that. And then looking at what I would call, people who consider themselves private militias, like the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys, and calling them to arms, really, and trying to get them to act. And it's still hard for me to even say now, like, that he was trying to form a private militia. That sounds really weird to me. And yet that's what he was doing. And it even sounds weird to me, even after I've been attacked by that that the president was inciting. And I still feel like, wow, is that, could that really have happened? And so I think we have to understand what's happening. And we know many of the not many, please forgive me for saying that. I certainly don't want to overstate this, but we do have some Congress people that appear to be complicit, have supported the president in many ways over time, and have been in touch with many of these groups through their social media, spurring some of them on. There's been reports by the groups that they've had contacts. And so to see, when I'll just tell you, Ben McAdams is a former congressman, and he was here with his daughter, who's my daughter's age, near the holidays before, kind of in mid-December. And he was bringing my daughter and his daughter into the Capitol and was stopped by a member of the Capitol Police. They said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm a member." "And who are these girls?" And these were girls, they're 15 years old. And he said, "You can't have guests in the Capitol." And so to then see on January 5th, that there were large, 8 to 10 to 15, 8 to 12 kind of groups wandering around the Capitol. And this was, this has been reported by numerous people, to see that was happening. And then to know that the next day we were attacked by members of the groups that seemed to be going around the Capitol. I think we have to believe our eyes. We have to believe what we know, and having a background in the military and having numerous security briefs. I think we have to make sure that we are addressing the actual problems at hand and not just turning a blind eye or kind of pretending they're not happening.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that actually leads me to another question I would ask as a veteran of the U.S. military. One of the things that we've been concerned about ADL for some time is we've seen for years that white supremacists have been making the case that they should try to join law enforcement of the military to get training, as they call it. What's your sense about the extent of the extremists' penetration of the military? Do you have any, again, based on your own experience, as well as what you've learned since the attack? I wonder if you could share any thoughts about whether this is really a significant issue or maybe even exaggerated or whatnot.
So I believe deeply that we need some systemic reform in our police force. In fact, before I decided to run for Congress, I had thought I would be going into criminal justice reform and an area around that. And yet, even with a background in criminal justice reform and certainly supporting the Police and Justice Act, the George Floyd Act, and I was an original co-sponsor, I was still surprised at the reports of the difference in preparation for the BLM marches by the police and the attacks on January 6th. And what I mean by that is the police called on all sorts of help and resources, from my understanding at this point, before the Black Lives Matter protest. And these protesters, from what we knew, I think they, there had been violence, there had been bricks through windows, but we're then looking at January 6th for a violent extremist group that had been known to try to take a governor hostage. So wouldn't you, knowing these violent extremists were coming into town, be every bit as on alert, if not more alert, because these are people known not to just throw bricks through windows, which is very dangerous, but to carry firearms and zip ties and take people prisoner. And they were coming to stop Congress from doing its constitutional duty in a way that was different from the protesters. And so the disparity in the treatment leads me to believe that there were some in law enforcement that felt more comfortable with these violent extremists, that felt like they were in some way people that would be a partner more maybe in law enforcement, and some of what you just suggested. So we obviously have work to do. It was a little bit chilling as we're calling our National Guard. I'm a veteran. I have always found our active duty military to be very professional, one of the most professional forces across the world. I've relied on them. And I can tell you, after being pinned down in the gallery of the House of Representatives with a violent mob, if you see those pictures where the police were barricading the door and had their guns drawn, that's where I was. We were one of the last groups to be able to evacuate from the gallery, and to see the National Guard, to hear the National Guard was coming into town, provided me a great sense of relief. So it was also with this almost, hard to, again, consider it, that suddenly the Secret Service was saying, well, they were a little worried about the National Guard because there could be violent extremists in the National Guard. And certainly we saw that some members of the Guard were sent home. So obviously there's a problem there when you have to worry about those types of things. We know that it's been a problem in the military. And I'll tell you, the reason I was late is I was just on the floor of the House, and I took a little bit longer maybe than I should have, because I just took one of the harder votes of my, albeit short, career. I just voted to provide General Austin a waiver to serve as our next Secretary of Defense. I generally don't believe in waivers. I believe deeply in civilian control of our military. I don't think career service officers are very good at exerting civilian control or understanding it very well. However, I also am deeply concerned about extremism in our military, about rooting it out. And I think these times and this crisis calls for a Black Secretary of Defense. And I also know national security, and I know the Defense Department, and there are not many Black leaders in national security and in the Department of Defense. We have a lot of people of color that serve, but too few in leadership. It is a critical problem. So I think we need to make radical change there and in other areas. And so I have to tell you, it was a really tough vote for me, because I also, you're inculcated as a member of the military from the start with this belief in civilian control. And I do believe deeply in it. And I don't like having a service member who served so long being our next SecDef. But again, because of my concerns with violent extremism in our military, and the really particular need that we have right now to root that out, I did vote for the waiver for General Austin.
Wow. I mean, literally, we live in historic times. So it's amazing to think you came right from the floor to our webinar. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
I hope, Congresswoman Cheryl, this is the start of an ongoing dialogue. I'd like to ask you a lot more questions, but I want to pass it over to Deb, who's kind of running the whole show here. Deb.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and from racing and getting to your office and getting on so quickly. It's greatly appreciated. And I told Jonathan we were going to wrap, but I do have one question. It's popped up a bunch of times in the chat. I think it's been echoed throughout this call. Just briefly, what do you say to folks who are desperate for things that they can do in their community to fight this kind of hate and extremism? What do you suggest?
That is a really great question. And this is something that I've been racking my brain for, because in my sister district, there's a Congressman, Josh Gottheimer, who and we both share a county. And as I was campaigning before the 2018 election, he had swastikas painted on his yard signs in the county that we share and on a garage.
I remember that.
But yeah, it was shocking because I guess I had held New Jersey. I had maybe a Northeast attitude about some of this, like, oh, those are things you see in the Deep South, but here in New Jersey, we're diverse, and
Yeah.
we don't do that. We don't paint swastikas on yard signs and garages. So it was an eye opener for me. So I think in our own community, I think there's a couple things. I think we have to be very careful about how we go about this and meet some of this hatred with a desire to engage in understanding conversations, because there are times when I have heard people use language that I think is inappropriate. And I've seen a lot of, we'll be on a meeting or something, and I'll have a lot of people side chatting about how awful that person is. I think we need to address it head on and say, I really appreciate your opinion, but the language you used was problematic for me. And let me tell you why and what that connotates to me, and make sure that person understands it. Because I'll tell you, as I've gotten older, language changes really quickly. So we have to, I think, have these open dialogues to help open people's hearts on one level. When it does come to hatred and racism, and not stuff that maybe, people are not using the PC language now, and we need to educate them. When it comes to that deep type of hatred and racism, which we've seen across the country, I think report it. I think hold people accountable. So if it's an elected official, I think that person needs to be held accountable. I'll tell you, I'm struggling with how to hold people accountable who I think were complicit, who I think supported this president. Does that mean not co-sponsoring legislation with them? And there's tough balances to be had. But I think if you have the ability, I think probably what scared some of the people in office the most that have, I think, been complicit with the last president has been corporate sponsorship. If you have an ability to affect corporate sponsorship, I think that's an important issue. And then I also think just education. And I know the ADL was working on that in Portland after some issues that we had there. And I think we had brought that to Jersey City. We were talking about it because of issues that we had there as well, of anti-Semitism and the shooting that took place there. So I think education is something that this country has not done enough of. And there are several pieces of legislation I put forward. I'm just going to say one final thing, because I know I've gone on too long and I know we're wrapping up. I think that when I was growing up, this country had a national narrative that gave us all this unifying vision of what it was to be an American. There were deep problems with that, with respect to how it treated people who have ancestors who were enslaved, with how we treated people who are Native Americans. There were deep, deep problems with our national narrative. And by that, I'm speaking of, how explorers came to an empty country and we're suddenly in America. Obviously, that's wrong. Or the idea that there was sort of Rome, Greece, Europe, and America. And obviously that doesn't take everything into account. But without a national narrative and a unifying vision of who we are as Americans, I think that the past president was able to fill a hole and able to create this narrative that was untrue, divisive, full of hate. And I think we need to figure out who we are as Americans and what we stand for, and what unifies us, and what it means to care about this country. Because I thought we knew what that was, but after the last 4 years and the attacks on our democracy, the attacks on diversity, the real hatred that this president was able to grow, I realized that there is work to be done.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Well, admittedly, what ended up not being an easy question to answer, and you did it with grace and direction, and I think even provided people with a little bit of hope. So thank you for that. And thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Oren, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. Thanks for sticking with us, even though we ran a little bit over. I think you'll agree that it was well worth it. And I look forward to seeing you on our next Fighting Hate from Home call, which will be taking place next month. All right, take care and stay safe.
Thank you
Thank
again,
you.
Congresswoman Cheryl.